Hey guys, tonight we begin with a soft descent into one of the least relaxing topics imaginable, which is always fun when you're trying to fall asleep. We're heading straight into the lives of Victorian women, specifically the delicate, stressful, and downright bizarre expectations that surrounded pregnancy and childbirth. So, if you're already tucked into bed, dim the lights, adjust your blanket, and try not to think about the fact that 19th century doctors basically guessed their way through gynecology with all the confidence of a man who once bled a patient for hiccups and decided it worked. Because, well, that was the vibe. Now, Victorian society loved rules. Rules about clothes. Rules about when to speak. Rules about who could sneeze in public without scandal. So of course, pregnancy came with a full set of instructions, strict, suffocating, and frequently contradictory. You weren't just expecting, you were expected to behave as if your womb was now the centerpiece of national stability, which, in many ways, it actually was. If you were middle or upper class, producing heirs wasn't just personality, was a duty. Your husband's name, your family's wealth, the continuity of property, all wrapped up in whether or not you could successfully push out a small, slightly squished human. And the rules began right from the moment you were suspected of being pregnant. Notice I said suspected, because Victorian doctors didn't exactly have pregnancy tests. They had observations. Things like a woman glowing or suddenly feeling nauseous, or just looking at her and saying, yes, her humors seem fertile today. I'm not kidding, diagnosing pregnancy was part medical science, part staring contest. And, naturally, women were advised not to make public announcements too soon. Why? Because the worst possible outcome in Victorian society wasn't miscarriage itself, but people knowing you'd had one. Social shame was the enemy, not mortality. Now, if you were confirmed to be pregnant, or at least everyone decided to act like you were, the rules began piling up. You were supposed to avoid anything stimulating, which meant no spicy food, no strong emotions, and definitely no literature that might excite the nerves. Yes. Victorian women were sometimes told not to read novels while pregnant, because, heaven forbid, Jane Austen's witty banter send the fetus into moral decline. But that wasn't all. You also had to keep your body in line. Corsets didn't go away just because you were carrying another person inside you. Maternity corsets existed, ingeniously designed torture devices that expanded just enough to allow for pregnancy while still crushing your ribs and rearranging your organs. After all, appearances mattered. God forbid the neighborhood see you walking around looking like you were pregnant. And speaking of appearances, one major expectation was modesty. Women were urged to hide the fact of pregnancy for as long as humanly possible. There was something vaguely indecent about acknowledging the process by which the baby got there. So instead of celebrating expectant mothers, Victorian society liked to pretend nothing was happening right up until the moment a baby magically appeared. If you were wealthy, you might even vanish from social gatherings during the later months, retreating into a kind of genteel house arrest. Out of sight, out of scandal. Now, what about the actual medical care? Well, brace yourself. The Victorian era was one long, experimental playground of bad ideas. Doctors debated endlessly about what pregnant women should and shouldn't do. Exercise? Maybe, but not too much. Food. Eat well, but don't overindulge, because gluttony was considered a moral failing that could deform the child. Too much sugar might lead to a baby with a weak constitution. Too little, and you were basically starving your heir. So, Congratulations, you were wrong either way. Then there was the terrifying obsession with morality and its supposed effects on unborn children. A pregnant woman was expected to maintain pure thoughts, calm behavior, and absolute gentleness at all times. Because the child, people thought, could literally absorb her emotional state. If she got angry, the baby might come out with a violent temper. If she was vain, the baby might be marked with birth defects. If she saw something shocking, the baby could carry a physical imprint of that trauma. It was like a never-ending warning label. Be careful, or you'll ruin your child before it's even born. No pressure. Let's float gently now toward the topic of pain management. Because childbirth, as you may have heard, is not exactly a spa treatment, and Victorian medicine was still fumbling its way toward modern anesthetics. For most of the early 1800s, pain relief in childbirth was considered controversial. Some religious voices even argued it was sinful. After all, wasn't pain during childbirth part of Eve's curse? To dull the agony was to defy God himself. And yes, that meant many women were told to just grit their teeth and offer up their suffering to heaven, while men in the next room enjoyed cigars. But then chloroform arrived, and everything changed. Well, kind of. Chloroform started being used in the mid-1800s, and one of the biggest endorsements came when Queen Victoria herself used it. During the birth of her 8th child in 1853, naturally, if it was good enough for the Queen, suddenly it was morally acceptable for everyone else. Funny how divine curses tend to loosen up when royalty is involved. But even then, not all doctors were convinced. Some thought anesthetics made women unruly. There were reports of women swearing, screaming, and even biting during chloroform deliveries, which apparently shocked their delicate male physicians. As if the alternative agonizing shrieks was somehow more refined. Now, while upper-class women debated chloroform etiquette, working-class women had a much harsher reality. Many gave birth at home, often with little to no medical assistance. Midwives were common, but their training varied wildly. Some were excellent. Others relied on folklore and passed down tricks that ranged from the vaguely useful to the absolutely ridiculous. Advice might include things like tying a key to a red ribbon and hanging it around the mother's neck for protection, or making her drink beer to strengthen her blood. Effective? Probably not. Comforting? Maybe. And then there were the rules after birth. Postpartum recovery, as we call it now, was treated like another moral battleground. Women were expected to be strong, nurturing, and patient immediately after delivery. Never mind that they had just survived a process that killed thousands every year. Speaking of which, childbirth was deadly. Maternal mortality rates were terrifyingly high. Puerperal fever, essentially infection after childbirth, claimed countless lives. Doctors, who still hadn't fully embraced hand-washing, often carried germs from one patient to the next. Yes, the very people meant to help were sometimes the biggest danger in the room. And yet, despite all this, women were expected to keep going. Producing children was often their main purpose in marriage. And if you think that sounds bleak, remember, Queen Victoria had 9 children. 9. And she famously hated being pregnant. She described the process as wearisome, disagreeable, and downright miserable. But she still kept at it, because that's what was expected. If the Queen herself couldn't escape the rules, imagine the pressure on ordinary women. So here we are, drifting in this strange world where pregnancy was sacred and shameful, private and public, medical and moral, all at the same time. A world where a woman could be scolded for sneezing too loudly, lest she disturbed the unborn child's temperament, where her body wasn't her own, but rather a vessel for family duty, religious doctrine, and societal judgment. So, let's drift a little further into the world of Victorian pregnancy. You've made it through 9 months of corsets, moral lectures, and being told not to read novels in case Dickens turned your fetus into a revolutionary. Now comes the big finale. Confinement. Confinement sounds dramatic, and honestly, it was. In the Victorian sense, confinement meant the period before and after childbirth where a woman was expected to retreat from the world, not only because she was heavily pregnant and probably exhausted, but also because society preferred to keep the whole ordeal invisible. Again, pregnancy was considered vaguely indecent. People knew how babies got here, but apparently pretending not to know was more polite. So, women, especially upper-class women, were tucked away in their bedrooms or private chambers, sometimes weeks before the birth, sometimes longer. Their job was simply to wait, in seclusion, until it was time to deliver. It was equal parts medical precaution and social theatre. For working-class women, of course, confinement was a luxury. If you had laundry to scrub or meals to cook, you weren't exactly vanishing upstairs with a team of attendants. You worked until you physically couldn't, but the middle and upper classes leaned into the ritual, treating it almost like a sacred cocooning. And once the baby was born, confinement continued. A new mother might spend 6 weeks or more in her room, away from the world, recovering. Doctors often recommended absolute rest, which sounds nice until you remember Victorian rest meant lying in bed with no fresh air, no exercise, and a high risk of blood clots. But still, society insisted this was the proper way to recover. Visitors were limited, light was dimmed, curtains drawn. The room itself was often overheated, because doctors believed warm air was safer for mother and child. Whether or not the mother was sweltering was irrelevant. Now, this period of confinement wasn't just about recovery, it was also about morality. A woman was expected to emerge from her confinement renewed, serene, and ready to mother with angelic patience. If she looked worn out, moody, or, heaven forbid, resentful, then clearly she hadn't approached the process with the right spiritual mindset. Postpartum depression, not a thing, at least not officially. If you were sad after childbirth, people said you were weak, selfish, or even hysterical, which of course helped tremendously. And then came the churching ritual. This was an old tradition, still lingering in parts of the Victorian world, where women attended a religious service after giving birth to be purified. Because, childbirth was apparently a little too earthy for polite society. The ritual framed motherhood as both miraculous and slightly dirty, which is quite the balancing act. Some women welcomed it, others found it insulting. Either way, it reinforced the message that their bodies weren't just their own, they were bound up in religious and social rules. Let's float now into the strange world of Victorian baby care. Because once the ordeal of childbirth was over, the rules didn't stop. They multiplied. Babies were immediately wrapped, bound, and swaddled into little fabric bundles. The logic was that tight swaddling prevented deformities and kept the limbs straight. In reality, it often restricted movement and made babies overheat. But hey, straight legs mattered more than comfort. Feeding was another battlefield. Breastfeeding was considered the natural duty of a mother, but also inconvenient for fashionable women. Wealthier mothers often hired wet nurses, other women, usually from poorer backgrounds, to breastfeed their children. This practice came with a whole stack of prejudices. People worried that wet nurses could pass on not only physical health issues but also moral traits. Yes, Victorians believed babies could absorb the personality of the woman nursing them. If she was thought lazy, immoral, or from the wrong background, it might corrupt the child, which is ironic, given that wet nurses were often overworked, underpaid, and shamed for doing the very job wealthy women asked them to do. For mothers who breastfed themselves, rules abounded. Don't nurse if you were upset, because your sour mood might spoil the milk. Don't nurse if you'd eaten onions, because the baby would inherit your bad taste in food. Don't nurse too often, or you'd weaken the child's digestion. In short, whatever you did, you were wrong, which was pretty much the theme of Victorian motherhood. And if a baby needed extra food, well, Victorian feeding bottles existed, but they were essentially bacteria farms. Long tubes and hard-to-clean rubber teats made them a paradise for germs. Infant mortality was high, and contaminated feeding equipment didn't help. But mothers were often told these contraptions were modern, scientific, and therefore better than traditional methods. Once again, progress turned out to be a little deadly. Now, one thing Victorians were absolutely obsessed with was control. Babies weren't meant to dictate the household. Mothers were told not to spoil infants with too much attention. Leathern crypt was supposed to strengthen the lungs. Rocking or cuddling a baby too often was frowned upon. The goal was a disciplined child, not a happy one, which explains quite a lot about the stiff, formal portraits we see of Victorian families. Nobody looks particularly cuddly in those, and, of course, any problem, any illness, weakness, or death was almost always blamed on the mother. If the baby didn't thrive, it must be her diet, her attitude, her behavior during pregnancy, or her moral failings, passed down through the mysterious medium of maternal influence. Fathers, naturally, were exempt from such scrutiny. Their role was to provide money, smoke cigars in another room during labor, and occasionally glance at the child as proof of their own virility. The pressure was crushing. Women were expected to produce children regularly, raise them with endless patience, and never complain. To fail was not just personality, was seen as a moral collapse. The irony, of course, is that the medical system stacked the odds against them. Poor hygiene in hospitals, ignorance about infection, and rigid social rules meant maternal and infant mortality remained alarmingly high. Yet, instead of acknowledging systemic problems, society just blamed women. Because that was simpler. Take, for example, the epidemic of puerperal fever, postpartum infection. Doctors resisted the idea that they themselves were the cause, despite evidence piling up. Ignaz Semmelweis, the Hungarian physician who suggested hand-washing in the 1840s, was mocked relentlessly by his peers. Because, apparently, the idea that doctors' hands might carry disease was more offensive than the fact that women kept dying after childbirth. So, women continued to be confined, while their doctors marched in and out of rooms, sometimes straight from autopsies, with zero hand hygiene. And yet the mothers were still the ones shamed if anything went wrong. This all created a strange, suffocating paradox. Pregnancy was sacred, but also shameful. Childbirth was natural, but also dangerous. Motherhood was noble, but also never good enough. Women were constantly measured against an impossible standard, and the rules never stopped shifting. Even Queen Victoria herself couldn't escape the contradictions. She was the symbol of domestic motherhood, and yet she despised the process of pregnancy, calling babies ugly and childbirth degrading. But as the queen, she had to perform motherhood as duty, whether or not she liked it. Ordinary women didn't even get the choice of pretending. So here we are, still drifting in this curious, claustrophobic world where women carried both the burden of biology and the blame of society. A world where confinement wasn't just about recovering from birth, but about being tucked out of sight. Where nursing wasn't just feeding, it was a moral test. And where babies themselves were wrapped, judged, and disciplined before they could even sit up. And in the next stretch, we'll wander even further into the Victorian nursery. Because if you thought the rules for mothers were rigid, just wait until you hear the rules for raising children. Spoiler, they involve moral lectures, cold baths, and more starched clothing than seems reasonable for anyone under the age of 5. So, you've survived confinement, given birth with or without chloroform, and endured weeks of being tucked away like an embarrassing secret. Congratulations. Now you're officially a Victorian mother, which means the baby leaves your body but somehow never leaves your list of responsibilities or your ability to get blamed for everything. Let's drift upstairs into the Victorian nursery. And yes, nurseries were usually upstairs, in the less glamorous parts of the house, because children were meant to be hidden away almost as much as pregnancy itself. The nursery was not a whimsical, pastel-painted wonderland with plush toys. It was a controlled environment, staffed by nannies or governesses, if you were wealthy, and built around one central principle: discipline. Victorian parenting philosophy treated babies less like adorable bundles of chaos, and more like little adults who needed early correction. The nursery was basically a training ground for future respectable citizens, which meant fun was limited, emotions were suspicious, and comfort was rationed. Take, for instance, the daily routine. Babies and children were often subjected to cold baths. The idea was that cold water hardened their constitution, making them less likely to grow into weak, spoiled adults. Which sounds vaguely like torture, but to Victorians, it was tough love. Warm baths were seen as indulgent and morally suspect because, naturally, if you enjoyed yourself too much in water, that was basically the slippery slope to moral collapse. Clothing was another battlefield. Children were dressed in stiff, restrictive outfits from an early age. Even toddlers were trussed up in starched collars, buttoned boots, and heavy fabrics. Comfort was not the goal, appearance and propriety were. After all, how else would the neighbors know you were raising your children correctly unless they looked like miniature accountants? Now, food. Feeding children in Victorian times was another exercise in control. Rich families liked to brag about giving their children simple, plain food to instill humility. Think bread, porridge, boiled vegetables. Delicacies were reserved for adults. The belief was that children who ate bland diets would grow up disciplined and hard-working, which is funny because wealthy Victorians were gorging themselves on jellied eels, beef pies, and pudding. But heaven forbid their toddler tastes something flavorful. And let's not forget the medical advice. Victorian doctors and childcare manuals were full of helpful tips that mostly sound horrifying today. For example, it was thought dangerous to pick up or soothe a crying baby too often. This would supposedly make them soft, needy, or manipulative. Yes, the idea was that a 6-month-old could learn to manipulate its parents by crying too much. So, parents were advised to leave babies alone in their cribs, even if they screamed for hours. Sleep training, Victorian edition, except without the comforting reassurances or the child psychology to back it up. Of course, not everyone followed these rules. Some mothers ignored the manuals and picked up their babies anyway. But the prevailing advice was that discipline should start from day one, which meant the nursery often echoed with crying, while nannies proudly reported how independent the child was becoming. And, speaking of nannies, these women wielded enormous influence in Victorian households. Wealthy parents often delegated the bulk of childcare to them, especially in the early years. Mothers were expected to produce babies, and fathers were expected to provide money. But nannies and governesses did the actual raising, which led to strange dynamics, where children often bonded more with their caregivers than with their own parents. Queen Victoria herself was famously attached to her governess, Louise Lazanne, much more than to her chilly mother. So when we picture Victorian family values, we should remember that much of the emotional labor was outsourced. Now, the nursery wasn't just about physical care, it was about shaping character. Children were expected to learn obedience, modesty, and self-control as early as possible. This often came with religious overtones. Bedtime might include not just a lullaby, but a stern little sermon about sin and the dangers of selfishness. Because nothing says sweet dreams like the looming threat of eternal damnation. Victorian children's books reinforced this moral training. Stories weren't about adventure and fun, they were about consequences. Disobedient children met tragic fates, while virtuous ones were rewarded with approval and sometimes a shiny new toy. Think less Winnie the Pooh and more Behave, or you'll literally die. A cheerful genre, perfect for sending kids off to sleep in cold beds with empty stomachs. And if you're wondering how parents justified all this, the answer is simple: fear. The Victorian era was obsessed with respectability. Families worried constantly about social judgment, about raising children who might embarrass them, about producing heirs who were strong enough to carry on the family line. Too much comfort, too much affection, too much pleasure, all was seen as potential threats to the future. So children were molded with rigid discipline in the hope that it would pay off later. Of course, this discipline could backfire. Many Victorian memoirs describe childhood as a mix of loneliness and repression. Upper-class kids, in particular, grew up isolated, seeing their parents only at designated times, dressed in their best clothes, and instructed to sit quietly like decorative figurines. Family life was more performance than intimacy, and yet this was held up as the ideal. Working-class families, meanwhile, lived very different realities. Children there weren't confined to nurseries, they were often put to work as soon as they could walk. Factory labor, street selling, or domestic chores filled their days. The idea of a carefully managed nursery schedule was laughable. But even in poorer homes, discipline was stressed. Children were taught early that survival required obedience and endurance. Comfort was rare, and complaining was dangerous now. Let's float for a moment into the world of Victorian medicine again, because childcare was not immune to medical theories. Doctors had endless advice about teething, for example. Teething was blamed for almost every infant, ailment, fever, diarrhea, even death. Treatments included lancing the gums with sharp instruments to help the teeth through, which, as you might imagine, didn't exactly improve things. Some doctors also prescribed soothing syrups, many of which contained alcohol, opium, or both. So yes, Victorian babies were often knocked out with what was essentially laudanum candy. Calm, quiet, and blissfully drugged. Perfectly respectable. And then there were the toys, or lack thereof. Toys were often simple, wooden, and designed to be improving. Building blocks. Religious picture books or puzzles were acceptable. Dolls were common for girls, but even those carried moral lessons about future domesticity. Anything frivolous or purely entertaining was frowned upon. Childhood wasn't supposed to be fun, it was supposed to be a preparation for adulthood. So, the Victorian nursery was less a place of joy and more a place of preparation, discipline, and occasionally chemical sedation. And through it all, the burden of responsibility rested on mothers. Whether or not they were actually the ones doing the day-to-day work. If a child misbehaved, grew sickly, or died, it was her fault. If the child thrived, it was usually credited to good breeding or divine favor. Once again, the mother got the blame, but rarely the credit. This constant scrutiny created a suffocating atmosphere. Motherhood was never just about love, it was about proving your worth to society, to your husband, to God, and for many women, it was exhausting. Imagine trying to recover from childbirth while being told that one wrong look, one indulgent snack, one sigh of frustration could doom your baby's character forever. No wonder Queen Victoria looked miserable in so many portraits. She was living the same contradictions as everyone else, just on a larger stage. So, as we sink deeper into this story, keep in mind that Victorian childhood wasn't all dreary sermons and cold baths. There were moments of warmth, nannies who showed genuine affection, siblings who found fun in small rebellions, families who bent the rules. But the dominant culture was rigid, moralistic, and often downright cruel by modern standards. So, the baby has survived swaddling, cold baths, and possibly being sedated with opium syrup. They've endured the nursery with its discipline, starch, and moral sermons. Now comes the next phase, childhood proper. And if you thought the Victorians might finally relax a little, well, no. Childhood in Victorian England wasn't a period of freedom. It was basically a boot camp for adulthood, complete with rigid gender expectations and endless lessons about respectability. Let's start with education. If you were wealthy, your schooling began at home with tutors and governesses. Boys were drilled in Latin, Greek, mathematics, and the classics, because nothing says preparation for life like memorizing long passages of Cicero. Girls, on the other hand, were given an education designed to make them pleasing companions and future wives. That meant music, French, a bit of history, and of course, endless lessons in embroidery. Heaven forbid a daughter of the house couldn't produce a decorative cushion while singing a polite ballad in passable French. Of course, this wasn't just about learning, it was about social status. A well-educated boy was destined for university, the clergy, the military, or some other noble path. A well-educated girl was destined to be decorative. The bar was set differently from the very beginning, and families leaned hard into this divide. A son who showed no talent for Latin might still be praised for his character, while a daughter who questioned her needlework was practically a walking scandal. Middle-class families often aspired to this model, even if they couldn't afford private tutors. Girls were still expected to learn accomplishments, while boys got whatever scraps of formal schooling were available. For the working class, education was far less accessible. Until the later part of the century, many children worked instead of learning. Factories, mines, and street labor were their classrooms. Only with the 1870 Education Act did elementary schooling become compulsory, at least on paper. Even then, work often won out. Respectability was a privilege. Now, schooling itself wasn't exactly a bundle of joy. Even for the wealthy, lessons were rigid, repetitive, and designed to instill obedience more than curiosity. Recitation, memorization, and moral lectures filled the day. Fun was not part of the curriculum. Play was tolerated only if it reinforced discipline, teamwork, or physical toughness, which is why boys got sports like cricket, while girls got genteel walks in the garden. Nothing too sweating was unladylike. And then there was religion. Victorian childhood was steeped in it. Morning prayers, scripture lessons, moral tales, these were as important as math or reading. Children were constantly reminded of sin, obedience, and duty. Fear of God was a tool of discipline as much as fear of parents. It's no wonder Victorian bedtime stories often sounded like little sermons. Sweet dreams, children behave, or eternal damnation awaits. Let's drift a little into gender expectations now, because this was perhaps the strongest current of Victorian childhood. Boys were groomed to be leaders, protectors, and heirs. Girls were groomed to be modest, quiet, and decorative. From clothing to lessons to daily behavior, everything reinforced these roles. Boys were encouraged to roughhouse within limits. A scuffed knee was a sign of manly vigor. Girls, meanwhile, were told to sit straight, smile politely, and never raise their voices. A loud girl was practically a national crisis. Even toys reflected these divisions. Boys got toy soldiers, trains, and mechanical gadgets. Girls got dolls, miniature tea sets, and tiny sewing kits. Boys were told stories of explorers, adventurers, and military heroes. Girls were told moral tales of obedient daughters and virtuous wives. Imagination was allowed, but only along gendered lines. A girl who wanted to be a pirate, absolutely scandalous. A boy who wanted to knit, a moral failing. Of course, some children rebelled in small ways. They snuck books, invented games, or mocked their governesses behind closed doors. But in general, the system was relentless. Every moment of childhood was shaped toward becoming the right kind of adult. Now, let's not forget about discipline, because Victorian parenting manuals loved discipline. Corporal punishment was common in schools and homes. Canes, straps, and stern lectures were part of daily life. A child who disobeyed could expect swift correction. And again, the logic was moral as much as practical. Discipline wasn't just about behavior, it was about shaping the soul. To spare the rod was to risk raising a sinner. So yes, a lot of Victorian children grew up associating education with bruises. And through all of this, the ideal of respectability loomed large. A child wasn't just an individual, they were a reflection of the family's reputation. A well-behaved, neatly dressed child announced to the world that the parents were virtuous and successful. A messy, unruly child announced failure. Families were constantly judged by the behavior of their offspring, so the pressure fell heavily on mothers, once again. If a child misbehaved in public, it was her shame. Fathers might scold, but society looked to the mother as the one responsible for keeping everything in order. This constant pressure created strange contradictions. On one hand, children were told they were precious, the future of the family, and little gifts from God. On the other hand, they were treated with suspicion, discipline, and endless correction. Affection was rationed, while obedience was demanded in abundance. Childhood was less a time of innocence than a probationary period, where you constantly proved you were worthy of adulthood. Now, let's peek at health again, because Victorian childhood was riddled with hazards. Diseases like measles, scarlet fever, and diphtheria claimed countless lives. Infant and child mortality rates were shockingly high. Families often lost multiple children, which gave rise to a grim kind of emotional detachment. Some parents deliberately avoided bonding too closely with young children, fearing they wouldn't survive. Death was a constant shadow in the nursery, and yet, instead of addressing poor sanitation or lack of medical knowledge, society often fell back on moral explanations. If a child died, people might whisper about the mother's failings. Was she too indulgent, too vain? Did she eat the wrong thing while pregnant? Once again, women carried the blame for forces largely outside their control. Meanwhile, children who did survive were often pushed quickly into adult responsibilities. Working-class boys went to factories. Girls went into domestic service. Even middle-class children were pressed into family duties, writing letters, helping with younger siblings, or managing social calls. Childhood, in the modern sense of carefree years, was short. By 10 or 12, most Victorian children were halfway to adulthood in the eyes of society. But despite all this rigidity, we can imagine moments of real childhood peeking through. Boys sneaking out to play cricket in the fields. Girls secretly reading novels under the covers, despite being told it would overstimulate their fragile nerves. Siblings giggling at governesses when their backs were turned. Even in the most disciplined households, kids found ways to carve out small rebellions. Humanity has a way of slipping through the cracks, even in the starchiest environments. Still, the overall tone of Victorian childhood was heavy, moralistic, and full of pressure. Education wasn't just about learning, it was about respectability. Gender roles weren't just encouraged, they were enforced. Discipline wasn't just common, it was celebrated. And affection, that was optional. The ideal Victorian child was quiet, obedient, and respectable. Anything else risked scandal. So, as we drift further, let's follow these children into adolescence. Because if childhood was rigid, the teenage years were a whole new performance. Courtship rules, debutante balls, and the endless spectacle of being presented to society. That's where the contradictions of Victorian family life really take center stage. But for now, just imagine the scene. Upstairs nurseries, stiff collars, governesses reciting moral tales, and children quietly rehearsing for the long, respectable adulthood ahead of them. It's not the stuff of fairy tales, but it is, in its own repressed way, very Victorian. Let's keep floating. By the time a Victorian child reached adolescence, they weren't so much entering a new stage of life as stepping onto a stage set for them long ago. Childhood had been the rehearsal. Now the performance began. Society wasn't waiting for their inner selves to blossom. It was waiting for them to fill roles defined by gender, class, and a deep obsession with respectability. Let's start with girls, because their path was the most tightly choreographed. A Victorian girl's teenage years were less about exploration and more about careful preparation. She wasn't being raised to discover who she was. She was being trained to be presentable, modest, and, most of all, marriageable. The finishing touches of her education were less about knowledge and more about polish. Dancing lessons, music practice, and endless drilling in etiquette filled her days. A misstep in conversation, a laugh too loud, or even a glance held too long could mark her as unsuitable by the mid-teens. Girls from respectable families were often preparing for their debut the moment they would be presented to society, usually around age 17 or 18. But before that, the years between 12 and 16 were delicate. A girl was no longer a child, but she was not yet fully in the social marketplace. She lived in a liminal state, watched closely by parents, governesses, and chaperones. Every gesture mattered. The line between innocence and impropriety was razor thin. Now, boys had more freedom, but not by much. For adolescent sons of the middle and upper classes, this was the age of school. Public schools like Eton, Harrow, or Rugby became factories for respectability, producing the next generation of clergymen, officers, lawyers, and politicians. These institutions claimed to instill character, discipline, and leadership. In practice, they also taught conformity, hierarchy, and a stiff upper lip. Sports were celebrated as training for manhood. Classics still dominated the classroom, and the social networks formed that often mattered more than the knowledge gained. Adolescence, for boys, also carried its own rituals of transition. By 16 or 17, choices loomed: university, military service, apprenticeship, or professional training. But whatever the path, the end goal was the same: to take one's place as a respectable man. The freedom to define oneself, that was not really part of the program. Let's wander into courtship, the real theatre of Victorian adolescence. This was less about romance than negotiation. For the middle and upper classes, marriages were alliances, economic, social, and reputational. Love was nice if it happened, but respectability and financial stability came first, which meant that a young woman's behavior in her teens was under surveillance. Every interaction with young men was chaperoned. Even the act of exchanging glances at a dance was loaded with meaning. Courtship followed an intricate choreography. A gentleman might be introduced at a ball. He might ask for a dance, just one, to avoid scandal. He might call on the family home, but only under the watchful eyes of parents. Letters could be exchanged, but always with care. To forward, and a girl risked her reputation. Too cold, and she might miss her chance entirely. It was a balancing act, and one slip could brand her forever. For young men, the rules were different. They had more freedom to court, but also more pressure to prove they could provide. A young man without prospects was hardly welcome in the drawing rooms of respectable families. So even while pursuing romance, he was expected to demonstrate financial and moral stability. No one wanted a suitor with debts, bad habits, or questionable companions. A gentleman's reputation was his currency, just as much as his income. Meanwhile, for the working class, adolescence looked different. There were no debutante balls, no finishing schools. By 12 or 14, many working-class boys were already apprenticed or laboring full-time. Girls often entered domestic service, working as maids, cooks, or courtship still happened, of course, but it was far more direct. Meetings took place in streets, pubs, or at dances in local halls. Respectability mattered here too, but the standards were different. A young woman's reputation still determined her marriage prospects, but her daily survival also depended on labor. For working-class youth, adolescence was brief. Adulthood arrived early. Now, let's float back to the upper tiers, where adolescence was practically a spectacle. The debut season was the climax of a girl's teenage years. To be brought out meant being formally presented to society, often at court before the Queen herself. After that, she entered the social whirl of balls, dinners, and garden parties, all designed to parade her before potential husbands. It sounds glamorous, but in reality, it was exhausting and heavily regulated. Girls were on display, evaluated like rare books or fine horses. Too much wit, too little charm, or the wrong hemline could mean failure. The obsession with respectability made adolescence a performance of constant self-control. Girls learned to lower their eyes, soften their voices, and hide any strong opinions. Boys learned to conceal weakness, never cry, and project confidence even when terrified. Vulnerability was dangerous. Impropriety was ruinous. Authenticity was a luxury. Romantic ideals existed, of course. Novels and poetry filled with passionate declarations were popular among the young. But in real life, those passions had to be contained within rigid boundaries. A girl might dream of Byron, but she had to marry a banker. A boy might long for adventure, but he had to secure a respectable income first. Dreams were tolerated, as long as they didn't interfere with duty. Discipline, too, remained ever present. Schoolmasters kept boys in line with canes. Parents and governesses policed girls' behavior. Even the body was controlled: tight corsets for girls, stiff collars for boys. The message was clear: respectability required restraint, even at the cost of comfort. Religion also maintained its hold. Adolescent doubts, passions, and questions were often reframed as moral struggles. A girl's curiosity about the world might be redirected into piety. A boy's restlessness might be channeled into church service or missionary zeal. Faith was both a guide and a cage. Yet, for all this rigidity, cracks appeared. Secret romances bloomed in gardens and dark corners. Letters were smuggled past chaperones. Boys at school wrote poems to each other, hidden in the margins of Latin texts. Girls exchanged novels and whispered their true feelings in the safety of bedrooms. Humanity, once again, leaked through the seams, but the overarching theme of Victorian adolescence was performance. It wasn't about becoming who you were. It was about becoming who society demanded you to be. Every step, every word, every gesture was measured against the standard of respectability. Success meant acceptance into the adult world. Failure meant scandal, disgrace, or marginalization. So as we let our thoughts drift, picture a ballroom lit by chandeliers, rows of young women in white gowns, their mothers hovering like hawks, young men in black coats trying to look confident while calculating the size of their inheritance. Music swells, introductions are made, and the dance begins. It looks romantic, but beneath the surface, it's a transaction. This was adolescence in Victorian England, a long rehearsal for adulthood, scripted by duty, respectability, and the unyielding gaze of society. Childhood had been the nursery. Adolescence was the stage, and the performance was just beginning. So here we are. Childhood rehearsed, adolescence performed, and now the curtain rises on the real Victorian drama, marriage and family. This wasn't just a personal milestone. It was the stage on which the entire moral order of society played out. A Victorian man or woman wasn't simply expected to marry. They were expected to marry in a way that reinforced their family's reputation, their class standing, and, ideally, their bank account. Marriage in this period was less about love than about alignment. Love was welcome, poets celebrated it, novels romanticized it, but society didn't require it. What mattered was suitability. Was the bride modest, well-mannered, and from a respectable family? Was the groom financially stable, hard-working, and morally upright? If the answers were yes, then congratulations. Respectability had been secured. Let's start with the process. A respectable courtship ended not with a passionate elopement, but with carefully negotiated engagement. Families were involved, sometimes heavily. Parents vetted potential spouses with the scrutiny of an accountant reviewing ledgers. Property, dowries, and inheritances mattered deeply. For the upper and middle classes, marriage contracts could resemble small business mergers. Even the proposal itself was often discussed in advance. Romance existed, but only within the boundaries of practicality. Once an engagement was secured, the preparations began. Weddings were both personal rituals and public displays of morality. White dresses became popular after Queen Victoria wore hers in 1840, and soon every bride wanted to emulate her. The symbolism was clear: purity, innocence, and a new beginning. The ceremony itself was steeped in religion because the church was the final stamp of legitimacy. After all, a marriage was not simply about two people, it was about securing a lineage, stabilizing society, and reproducing the ideal Victorian household. Now, what did this ideal household look like? It revolved around a simple formula: the separate spheres. Men were expected to occupy the public sphere of work, politics, and commerce. Women were expected to remain in the private sphere of home, family, and moral guidance. This division was preached, printed, and enforced at every level. A respectable Victorian man supported his family through labour. A respectable Victorian woman managed her home with grace and self-sacrifice. That was the script, and deviation from it carried social risk. Of course, reality was more complicated. Many women, particularly in the working class, worked outside the home out of necessity. They laboured in factories, workshops, and as servants. But even then, the ideal of domesticity hovered like a cloud. A working-class woman might spend her day in a textile mill, but she was still judged on her ability to maintain a respectable home life in the evenings. Middle and upper-class women, meanwhile, were held up as angels in the house. Their role was to embody purity, selflessness, and moral authority. They were expected to create an environment where husbands could find refuge from the harsh world of industry and commerce. This was not framed as subjugation, at least not by Victorians themselves. It was portrayed as a noble mission. The home was a sacred sphere, and the woman was its priestess. A flattering title, perhaps, but one that came with suffocating expectations. Men, for their part, were also tightly bound. They were supposed to be providers, protectors, and moral leaders. Failure to provide for one's family was not just a financial problem, it was a moral failure. Respectability required a man to keep his household afloat, his children disciplined, and his wife well kept. The family man was not just a personal role. It was a badge of social credibility. Inside the home, daily life reflected these ideals. For middle-class families, the house became a symbol of respectability. Rooms were carefully arranged to demonstrate taste and refinement. Parlours displayed family portraits, good furniture, and books, whether anyone actually read them or not. The nursery was a symbol of responsible parenting. The dining room became a stage for ritualized meals, complete with correct manners and polite conversation. Everything in its place, everything signaling that the family was orderly, moral, and worthy of respect. Children were central to this image. They were seen as living proof of the family's virtue. Well-behaved children demonstrated successful parenting. Undisciplined children hinted at moral failure. This pressure shaped everything from education to mealtime routines. The home was not simply a place to live, it was a moral showcase. But beneath the polished surface, cracks appeared. The pressure to conform was enormous, and not every marriage was happy. Women who found themselves in difficult or abusive unions had few options. Divorce was rare, scandalous, and legally stacked against wives. Until the Divorce Act of 1857, ending a marriage often required an expensive private act of Parliament. Even after the law changed, the stigma was severe. Respectability depended on keeping up appearances, even if the reality behind closed doors was miserable. For men, the double standard was clear. Male infidelity was frowned upon, but it was often tolerated. Female infidelity, however, was catastrophic. A man could recover his respectability. A woman often could not. The system protected patriarchal authority, ensuring that the ideal of the respectable household stayed intact, even when the reality was fractured. Now let's drift a little lower down the social ladder, where the ideals remained but the circumstances were harsher. Working-class marriages were less about polite courtship and more about survival. Couples married young, often as soon as they could afford to set up a household. Wives worked alongside husbands, whether in factories, fields, or taking in laundry at home. The angel in the house ideal was far harder to achieve when both partners were exhausted by labor. And yet, even here, the aspiration toward respectability lingered. A clean home, polite children, and a steady income could elevate a family's social standing. However modest, the Victorian state reinforced these ideals. Laws regulating marriage, property, and custody all assumed that the family unit was the bedrock of society. Men retained legal authority over property and children, while women's rights were gradually expanded only in small increments. The family was imagined as a miniature monarchy, the husband as king, the wife as queen consort, and the children as loyal subjects. Stability mattered more than fairness. Religion, too, sanctified the arrangement. Clergy preached the virtues of wifely obedience, maternal sacrifice, and paternal duty. Family prayers and Sunday church services reinforced the sense that domestic life was not just a personal choice, but a divine command. The home was, in Victorian imagination, a moral fortress. Deviate from its rules, and you threaten not just your own household, but the stability of society itself. Of course, all of this pressure could make family life stifling. The emphasis on appearances created an environment where problems were hidden, feelings suppressed, and individuality restrained. But that was the price of respectability. Victorians believed that by upholding strict family roles, they were preserving order in a rapidly changing world. The Industrial Revolution was transforming cities, economies, and daily life. The family ideal was their anchor, their way of insisting that beneath the chaos, there remained a moral center. So, as we picture a Victorian marriage, don't imagine romance novels and candlelit confessions. Imagine instead the quiet grind of duty. A husband at his desk, calculating accounts. A wife in her parlor, managing servants or sewing by lamplight. Children in the nursery, supervised by a nurse or governess. A household that was less about personal happiness and more about maintaining the fragile scaffolding of respectability. That was the heart of Victorian adulthood. You married, you maintained a home, you raised children, and you embodied the values that society demanded. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't always happy, but it was respectable, and that was the only standard that mattered. Every respectable Victorian household carried a quiet awareness that sooner or later, sickness and death would come knocking. Life expectancy was improving compared to earlier centuries, but disease, childbirth, and poor sanitation still claimed lives with depressing regularity. Death wasn't a distant, clinical event hidden in hospitals. It happened in the home, often in the same rooms where people ate, read, and played the piano. Respectability didn't end with life. It extended into death, dictating how one became ill, how one died, and how one was remembered. Illness was practically a household guest in Victorian England. Tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera, smallpox, and scarlet fever all made their rounds with unnerving frequency. A cough might be nothing, or it might be consumption. Diarrhea might be indigestion or cholera. Respectable families responded with a mixture of piety, stoicism, and an endless arsenal of dubious remedies. Patent medicines promised cures for everything from headaches to cancer. Many contained alcohol, opium, or mercury. Doctors, when consulted, often prescribed bleeding, blistering, or tonics that did more harm than good. But the important thing was that families responded respectably. A sick child was tended carefully. A sick parent endured with dignity. Being ill in Victorian society was not just a physical condition. It was a moral performance. Respectable invalids were expected to suffer quietly, without complaint. Stoicism was a virtue. Too much groaning suggested weakness of character. Women, in particular, were praised for their ability to endure sickness with angelic patience. "She bore it bravely," was the standard phrase. Men, meanwhile, were expected to keep working as long as possible, proving their duty as providers. A lingering illness tested not just the body, but the family's ability to uphold respectability under strain. When death approached, it rarely came as a shock. Most households were familiar with its rhythms. The sick room became a stage for piety. Family gathered around the bed. Prayers were read. Last words were spoken with great seriousness, whether or not the dying person could still articulate them clearly. A good death meant one that was calm, resigned, and religious. The dying were supposed to meet their fate with composure. Panic or rebellion against death was frowned upon. Respectability demanded serenity, and then came the mourning. If Victorian marriage was a performance, mourning was an entire opera season. Queen Victoria herself set the tone. After Prince Albert died in 1861, she wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She turned mourning into a national pastime. Suddenly, respectable widows were expected to drape themselves in black crepe, cover mirrors with cloth, and avoid social engagements for years. For ordinary families, the rules were codified in etiquette manuals. Mourning periods varied depending on the relationship. A widow might spend 2 years in deep mourning, wearing nothing but black and avoiding all forms of gaiety. A sibling might mourn for 6 months. Even distant cousins merited a few weeks of somber dress. Not to follow these rules was to risk scandal. Respectability extended even to grief. Mourning wasn't just about clothing. It reshaped daily life. Black bordered stationery was used for letters. Jewelry was made from the hair of the deceased, twisted into brooches or rings. Photographs of the dead, sometimes propped into lifelike poses, were displayed on mantels. Funerals became social events, with attendance lists scrutinized for signs of respect or neglect. Death had become not just a private sorrow, but a public obligation. The Victorians were also fascinated with cemeteries expanded rapidly, turning into landscaped parks filled with elaborate monuments. A respectable family could not allow their loved one to be buried in a shabby graveyard. Tombstones were polished, epitaphs carefully chosen, and visits to the cemetery became part of social life. The dead, in a way, remained part of the family, their presence carefully curated through objects, rituals, and stories. This obsession with mourning also revealed some Victorian contradictions. On the one hand, they clung to the belief that heaven awaited, that death was a passage to eternal peace. On the other, they could not let go of the physical remains. Locks of hair, photographs, and mourning jewelry kept the deceased tethered to the living world. It was as if respectability required not only grieving, but proving that you were grieving correctly. Of course, mourning was stratified by class. The wealthy could afford elaborate funerals, horse-drawn hearses, velvet drapes, and professional mourners. Middle-class families followed suit as best they could, purchasing respectable black clothing and arranging proper ceremonies. Working-class families often struggled to cover funeral costs, but they still aspired to demonstrate respectability in death. Even the poorest scraped together funds for a decent burial, because a pauper's grave carried a heavy social stigma. Better to fall into debt than to let a loved one go into the ground without dignity. Mourning also reinforced gender roles. Widows were expected to retreat into solemn respectability. Their grief turned into a lifelong performance of piety and restraint. Widowers, meanwhile, were often encouraged to remarry quickly, especially if children needed care. Society praised women who sacrificed themselves to memory, while men were quietly excused from doing the same. The imbalance was glaring, but it was accepted as part of the natural order. Children, too, were folded into this culture of mourning. They were dressed in miniature black clothing, taught to recite prayers, and reminded that death was ever present. It was thought to be morally beneficial, instilling humility and awareness of mortality. Childhood was not protected from grief. It was trained to process grief as part of the respectable life cycle. Death also fueled industries. Mourning attire became a profitable business. Undertakers expanded their services, offering respectable funerals, complete with processions and mourning coaches. Stationery shops sold black-bordered paper. Jewelers crafted lockets for hair and miniature portraits of the deceased. Mourning had become an economy, a cycle of consumption that ensured grief was always on display. But perhaps the most telling detail is how normalized all of this was. For Victorians, illness and death weren't interruptions to life. They were woven into it. The home was both cradle and coffin, a place where life began and often ended. Families did not try to hide death. They arranged it, displayed it, and measured respectability by how well it was managed. So when we think of the Victorians as obsessed with death, it wasn't simply morbidity. It was continuity. In a world of industrial upheaval, urban squalor, and constant change, the rituals of mourning offered structure. They reassured people that even in death, respectability endured. As we let our thoughts drift here, imagine a dim Victorian parlour, curtains drawn, mirrors covered, family dressed in black, speaking in hushed tones. On the mantel, a locket containing a lock of hair, a photograph of the deceased, a Bible resting nearby. Outside, carriages lined the street for the funeral procession. It's quiet, orderly, and deeply controlled. Even grief itself has been turned into a performance of respectability. So, we've drifted through the nursery, the schoolroom, the ballroom, the parlour, and finally the funeral carriage. And at every stop, one word has hovered in the air like an ever-present ghost: respectability. The Victorians didn't just live their lives. They staged them. Childhood, adolescence, marriage, and even death were performed under the careful gaze of society. If you wanted to survive in Victorian England, not just physically, but socially, you had to play along. The system demanded it. Respectability was the ticket to acceptance, stability, and sometimes even survival. To be respectable meant you belonged. To fall outside those boundaries meant suspicion, scandal, or disgrace. Let's pause for a moment on how strange this was. Respectability wasn't really about morality in the pure sense. It wasn't about kindness, compassion, or honesty. It was about appearances, performance, and compliance with the script. A respectable man might be cold, distant, and deeply unfair, but as long as he provided for his family, went to church, and kept a tidy home, society approved. A respectable woman might be miserable, silenced, and exhausted, but if she maintained the appearance of purity and self-sacrifice, she was praised as the angel of the house. Respectability didn't measure happiness. It measured conformity, and that conformity ran deep. It shaped childhood by insisting that children were moral projects rather than people in their own right. It shaped adolescence by turning young men and women into performers of self-control, modesty, and ambition. It shaped marriage by locking couples into roles of provider and angel, whether those roles fit or not. And it shaped death by turning grief into a public spectacle, a demonstration of duty even in despair. Why did it matter so much? Because Victorian England was a society in transition. Industrialization was transforming everything: cities, labor, class, relations, even the rhythms of daily life. Old rural communities were breaking apart. People were moving into crowded cities, living among strangers, and competing for social mobility. Respectability became the glue that held this changing world together. It was the badge that told others, I am safe. I am proper. I belong. Think about the middle class in particular. They were the real drivers of respectability. The aristocracy already had status, and the working class often couldn't afford the performance. But the middle class was rising, expanding, and desperate to prove itself. They built tidy houses, filled them with moral furniture, and drilled their children in etiquette. They enforced codes of dress, speech, and behavior that signaled their place in society. Respectability was not just a virtue. It was a weapon, one that could lift you up or cast you out. Of course, the rules were riddled with contradictions. Men were praised for stoicism, yet allowed indulgences denied to women. Women were elevated as moral guardians, yet denied political rights. Children were idealized as innocent, yet treated as miniature adults in training. The whole system creaked with hypocrisy. But that was the point. Respectability was never about logic. It was about control, and yet it left legacies that still linger. The idea that childhood is a protected, morally significant stage of life, that's a Victorian inheritance. The notion that adolescence is a delicate time, requiring supervision and discipline, that too has roots in this era. The domestic ideal, where the family home is seen as the moral center of life, owes much to Victorian values. Even our discomfort with openly discussing death, after the Victorians ritualized it to excess, might be seen as a reaction to their mourning culture. In a way, we're still living with Victorian ghosts. We might not cover mirrors when someone dies, but we still judge grief by how it's displayed. We might not insist on strict chaperones at dances, but we still measure young people by their respectability, whether through grades, manners, or good choices. We might not speak of angels in the house, but debates about gender roles echo with Victorian undertones. The performance never fully ended. It just changed costumes. It's worth remembering, though, that not everyone played along. There were rebels, eccentrics, and quiet resistors. Writers like Oscar Wilde mocked the system. Artists painted darker, stranger visions. Some families loosened the rules, some individuals slipped through the cracks, and others simply ignored the script when they could. Respectability was powerful, but it was never absolute. The very fact that we can laugh at its absurdities today is proof that human lives always leaked through its seams. As we drift toward the end of our journey, picture a Victorian family portrait. The father stiff in his chair, the mother upright and serene, and the children posed with solemn expressions. Everyone dressed just so, everyone sitting still for the long exposure. It looks perfect, respectable, but behind those eyes are real people, tired, anxious, hopeful, and sometimes quietly rebellious. The photo captures the performance, not the truth. And maybe that's the best way to understand the Victorian world. It was a long, elaborate photograph, carefully posed, endlessly retouched, and meant to be admired. But behind the image, life was messier, stranger, and far more human. So tonight, we floated through a world where even grief had etiquette, where even childhood had expectations, and where every life was measured against the standard of respectability. It's strange, a little suffocating, sometimes darkly funny, and yet it shaped the modern world more than we'd like to admit. With that, we can close the curtain on our Victorian performance. Respectability was the script, life was the stage, and everyone, child, parent, spouse, mourner, played their part. Some did it well, some struggled, and some quietly rebelled. But all of them, in one way or another, helped write the story of what it meant to live, love, and die in 19th century England and now. With those thoughts tucked away, maybe it's time to let your own eyes close. Because history, like sleep, is sometimes best when it just drifts quietly on. So, here we are at the end. We've wandered through nurseries filled with embroidered samplers, parlor rooms buzzing with polite conversation, schoolrooms lined with stiff-backed chairs, and bedrooms draped in black crepe. We've looked at childbirth, adolescence, marriage, and death, all through that peculiar Victorian lens of propriety. And if there's one thing the Victorians truly excelled at, it was making life feel like a very long etiquette manual. Everything had its rule, its ritual, and its carefully constructed boundary. Even something as natural as giving birth came with layers of whispered expectations. Even something as inevitable as death turned into a performance of fabric, flowers, and stiff upper lips. Let's be honest, respectability was exhausting. But the Victorians clung to it because it gave them structure in a world that was rapidly unraveling. Steam engines shrieked across the countryside. Cities swelled into choking, smoky labyrinths. Old hierarchies trembled under the weight of factories and commerce. When the world outside felt uncertain, people retreated indoors and made the home into a fortress of ritual. A fortress against chaos, against change, and it worked in its way, at least on the surface. A respectable home looked stable. A respectable family looked happy. A respectable death looked peaceful. Appearances were everything, even when they weren't real now. You might be wondering, was anyone actually content in this elaborate theatre of life? The answer, as usual, is mixed. Some found comfort in the predictability. Knowing your role meant knowing your place, and that could feel safe. Others suffocated under the weight of duty, longing for a little more room to breathe. And some quietly broke the rules, an affair hidden behind lace curtains. A child sneaking out of the nursery, a mourner who decided not to wear black for 2 years. Even in the age of rigid propriety, humanity had its small rebellions. Still, the system was powerful. It defined what was normal, what was acceptable, what was allowed, and it seeped into every layer of society. The wealthy flaunted respectability like a prize ribbon. The middle classes guarded it with anxious vigilance. The poor, when they could, mimicked it to climb upward. It was a social currency as real as money. Lose it, and you could lose everything. And yet, here's the irony. The obsession with respectability made the Victorians oddly fragile. Their lives were so choreographed that any slip scandal, a misstep, an unwed pregnancy, a failed business could collapse the whole performance. Respectability promised stability, but it also demanded constant vigilance. It was like walking a tightrope in a corset. Possible, but not exactly comfortable. What remains, then, of this age of respectable living? Well, more than we sometimes realize. Our modern anxieties about image, about keeping up appearances, about posting the right version of ourselves for others to see, they have echoes in the Victorian parlour. The mediums have changed, but the performance endures. And as for the rituals of family life, we've inherited those too. The way we think about childhood as precious, the way we expect teenagers to be carefully supervised, the way we still hold weddings as grand performances, the way funerals are both personal and public, somewhere between grief and etiquette. All of that lingers. We've loosened the corset, but the shape is still there. It's easy, drifting here at the end, to chuckle at the absurdity. To imagine a Victorian gentleman solemnly arranging his facial hair before a family portrait, or a mother draping black ribbons over every lamp after her third cousin's passing. But beneath the stiff rituals, there were real people. Tired, flawed, affectionate, sometimes lonely, and sometimes content. Just people trying to navigate their world with the tools they had. And maybe that's the quiet comfort of history. Beneath all the rules and costumes, beneath the performances of respectability, humanity keeps poking through. It always has. It always will. So tonight we close the curtains on Victorian life. On its nursery rhymes and mourning veils, its fainting couches and endless sermons about duty. It was a world of control and constraint, but also of survival and stubborn endurance. Strange, suffocating, and sometimes oddly beautiful. If your eyelids are heavy now, you're in good company. A Victorian matron would approve. She would tell you that proper rest is part of a respectable routine. And she'd probably insist you say your evening prayers before closing your eyes. But you can skip that part if you like. For now, just let the candle burn low. Let the noise of the world fade, and let yourself drift. Because history, especially Victorian history, is best appreciated not in bursts of excitement, but in the slow, steady rhythm of lives long past. And with that, we've reached the end. Respectability has had its final bow. The stage is dark. The actors have gone. All that remains is the quiet good night.